Okay, so the purpose of this video is to discuss a few weapon sets and the tactics that you can use while playing them. So first up, let's talk about Tome. I'll be using the Arcanist Cookbook, so that does make it so that whenever I pick up a power orb, it triggers an explosion. That doesn't happen normally, so don't expect to see that in your game unless you're using that particular weapon. So first up, Magic Missiles. This is your spammable attack. If you hold it down, it channels. When it hits something, it generates these arcane power orbs. And once again, the explosion is not normal. These arcane power orbs can stack up to 5. When you use one of your special attacks, either Dimension Wave or Singularity Orb, the game checks to see if you have an arcane power buff stack. It'll consume one of those stacks and instantly reset the cooldown. Something to note about Magic Missiles. Even though you can channel it and that goes pretty quickly, it's actually more efficient to spam click, or button mash as it were, depending on if you're using a controller or a keyboard. You'll get up to top speed a lot faster, and you don't usually end up in a situation where you're sitting there using this at a rate that you need to just sit there and wail on something. If you are using it like that, then like say on a boss fight where there's a vulnerable time period, holding it down is fine. Otherwise, you can just click 3 or 4 times, get the arcane power orb to drop, get a little bit of extra damage in, and you're good to go. Alright, so next up is Dimension Wave. So Dimension Wave goes a certain distance, and it drops these shadows at the end of it. These shadows actually deal damage, and I'll show you on the training dummies. If you manage to hit something with it, the damage is pretty dramatic. That was 1300. Singularity Orb, as you can see, only did about 400 to 600 there. The trick with the shadows at the end of a Dimension Wave is they do damage based on the weapon you're currently holding. So, you'll notice that this does about, what was it, 1300? So it did 1400 that time. Let me get an Arcane Orb stack here. If I use the Dimension Wave, immediately swap to a hammer, see the damage dramatically increases, and that did 7200 that time. Something to note about the range of Dimension Wave. It's the exact same range as Singularity Orb. So one of the tactics you can do, Singularity Orb has a vacuum-like effect, which takes the monsters within that range, and you can see that that range is fairly wide, and it brings them to that location. And so if you're worried about learning the range of Dimension Wave, because it does take some practice before you can just look at a monster and then Dimension Wave and land perfectly on top of them. So if you're worried about doing that, one of the things you can get used to doing is aiming your Singularity Orb beside the monster. You don't want it to intercept any monsters, otherwise it will prematurely end before it gets to its full distance. So you'll launch a Singularity Orb and you'll launch a Dimension Wave at the same time. That'll vacuum all monsters to this location right on top of your Dimension Wave. Then you can swap to a hammer and basically just watch them all die. Something else to notice. Singularity Orb. So Singularity Orb you saw earlier did about 400 damage there. It also does damage based on the weapon you have equipped when it lands. There's a trick to making that work though, right? So when you launch Singularity Orb, you can swap to a hammer, but your animation is still going. So it's not necessarily going to work. So you have to dodge cancel out of the animation in order to get that to trigger. So let's do that. See, that was a 1500 hit as opposed to the 400 to 800 we were seeing earlier. That was 1100. So that's something to practice. Getting a good hammer and Singularity Orb combination is it can be really deadly. So that was a 2700 hit. So you can see that those are the tricks that you need to learn in order to take Tome to its max. So the next thing I want to talk about is Lightning Gun. can see here I'm using a Zealous Hammer and a Zealous Lightning Gun. So let's talk about Ball Lightning, because how I use Lightning Gun, this is the trick, right? I don't really use Lightning Trap and I don't really use Shock. Ball Lightning seeks out targets that have the electrocuted buff. When it hits them, it removes that buff. You'll see it disappears as it hits them. So the trick with Ball Lightning is it also does damage based on the weapon you have equipped. Using Heartbreaker takes advantage of the fact that it applies electrocuted periodically. And you'll notice that the Ball Lightning just stays on those enemies because they keep getting electrocuted. So the tactic you want to use is cast Ball Lightning, swap to Hammer, dodge around, drop some demon powers. If you're using a Zealous Hammer, you'll be generating more demon powers than it's possible to use. It's a very simple build. It's a very simple tactic. You just spam Ball Lightning when it's off cooldown, and dodge around with the hammer, and wait for Ball Lightning to get off cooldown, using your demon powers in between. So that's really all I wanted to talk about, so hopefully this short little tutorial on Tome tactics and Lightning Gun Hammer Heartbreaker tactics is helpful to you.